Welcome, everybody. We'll get started in just about one more minute here, giving everybody that full 15 minutes to transition from the keynote into their breakout session. So we'll get started in just a minute. Okay, my clock says it's 12:15, exactly 1/4 after the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for choosing to join our session today, Stronger Together, Growing Strategic Partnerships. I'm so pleased to have you here today. Before we dive in, we're going to go ahead and play our standard disclaimer.
This presentation was produced under U.S. Department of Education contract number GS00F115CA with Synergy Enterprises, Inc. The views expressed herein do not necessarily represent the positions or policies of the U.S. Department of Education. No official endorsement by the U.S. Department of Education of any product, commodity, service, or enterprise mentioned herein is intended or should be inferred.
All right. Thank you. So my name is Tracy Madej Carrigeorge. I am a member of the Office of Indian Education Technical Assistance Team, and I will be your facilitator today. So just a couple of housekeeping things before we get into our session. You have on the Pathable website or platform, you'll see us where our video and we are presenting. And just to the right of that, you see the chat area. There's several other tabs as well. In the poll tab, you'll see a prompt there where you can submit questions for our presenters. Please feel free to do that at any time throughout the session. We'll pause at the end to take questions, but feel free to type those questions at any time. The other tab is the Files tab. So there you can download a copy of our slide deck, as well as some other resources that we'll highlight a little bit later on. So thank you, everybody, for joining today. I'd like to introduce our panelists today that I'm so honored and pleased to have as our presenters. First, we have Ms. Johanna Jones, who is the coordinator for the Office of Indian Education at the Idaho State Department of Education. As coordinator, Ms. Jones builds collaborative partnerships with the tribes in Idaho, post-secondary institutions, and key education stakeholders to advance Indian education and increase awareness, support, and services for tribal communities. Mr. Ken Adams is of the Upper Mattaponi Indian Tribe, and he serves as the on-site consultant for the Virginia Tribal Education Consortium. Ken holds a bachelor's degree in industrial technology and is a 25-year veteran of the U.S. Air Force. He has an extensive background in promoting Native American education, including serving as chairman of the United Indians of Virginia and chairman of the Board of Trustees for Bacone College in Muskogee, Oklahoma. So glad to have you here today. I'm going to turn it over first to Ms. Johanna Jones to say a few words.
Hello and welcome. My name is Johanna and I oversee Indian education at the State Department in Idaho. I work to increase access, equity, and success for American Indian students in the K-12 public school system. One of the areas I'm seeking to re-energize is competency and literacy. As you know, with the recent release of the state's achievement data, that American Indian students are not reaching proficient levels of reading. Reading is perhaps the most fundamental piece of a person's education. So how do we remedy this crisis? One way is to increase culturally responsive pedagogy and practices into educative preparation programs. Share your thoughts with me and how can we work on this together? Thank you.
Thank you, Johanna. And now I'll give the floor to Ken to say a few words. Oh, you might be on mute, Ken.
Thank you, Tracy. Good afternoon to everyone from Virginia. I am Ken Adams. I am the project director for the State Tribal Education Partnership, sometimes referred as Education Project or Education Program. It's all the same. It's working together with the tribes in Virginia to produce products which are are correct for the education of Native students in the Commonwealth. Um, I'll give you a little bit of information about the program that we're involved in here in Virginia. It's, as you notice on the screen, there are 7 tribes listed: the Chickahominy Indian Tribe, the Chickahominy Indian Tribe Eastern Division, the Monacan Indian Nation, the Pamunkey Indian Tribe, and the Upper Mattaponi Indian Tribe. All these tribes came together to form a consortium of tribes in Virginia to work as a tribal education agency for the State Tribal Education Partnership. So we came together first about a year and a half ago when when a project was initiated by TEDNA, the Tribal Education Department's National Assembly, to bring us all on board as developing a tribal education agency for the Virginia tribes, which we did. We developed the agency, and here lately we've been involved in the capacity building portion of the Tribal Education Agency and the capacity building portion of the Virginia Tribal Education Consortium. That's basically what we're doing now. And in that, we have several goals and several absolute priorities that we're planning to produce in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So thank you so much for everyone being on board. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you both. Thank you both for that introduction. So here are our objectives for this session today. Throughout the session, we will identify some tips and strategies for growing collaborative and strategic partnerships, with the goal of preparing you, hopefully, for challenges that you might anticipate with growing those types of collaborative and strategic partnerships. By the end of the session today, we hope that you'll be able to specify some realistic and achievable actions that you can use in your programs for initiating, growing, and maintaining partnerships. So we will have a question for you to reflect on that at the end. Just a little heads up. So first, before we dive into sharing, we thought it would be important to define a few terms. And we wanted to differentiate amongst vendors, partners, vendors, collaborators, and strategic partners. So here's a little bit about how we're thinking about each. First, a vendor. We think of that when we think of a vendor, we're thinking of a supplier who provides goods or services. And the relationship is largely transactional, meaning that there is an exchange of money for something provided by that vendor. It could be documented. That agreement could be documented in a contract or a service agreement that defines those terms, how much and when that vendor will be paid. So for example, you may have a vendor that provides transportation for students to after school events. Generally speaking, vendor doesn't typically participate in leadership meetings or drive decision makings in the program or organization. And Johanna, you were going to share how you think about collaborators.
Yes, when I think of collaborators, I think of people or groups that have valuable expertise or resources and may be willing to share those, but who may not have the time or bandwidth to be a formal board member to help you with this work. An example might be a collaboration between a local school district and a community organization to provide space for after-school programs to operate. Collaborators may support your work by expanding program reach or impact, or by helping to increase program visibility or awareness. Often these are just people on the peripheral who will help you carry this message forward. Ken?
Oh, I was on mute too. Sorry, Ken, you're on mute. We didn't hear you.
I apologize for that. I would like to talk a little bit about strategic partners as we move forward with this STEP program here in Virginia. As I mentioned earlier, when we first started the project, we were approached by TEDNA, the Tribal Education Department's National Assembly, to form a possible consortium here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, build on the activities to produce education in a cultural relevant manner for Native students here in the Commonwealth. That's a big portion of it. The TEDNA was the initiator of the process, and in the process, all 5 tribes joined on board with TEDNA as a lead for a 1-year STEP grant. And that particular STEP grant was designed to form a TEA, Tribal Education Agency here in Virginia. So we started out with TEDNA as our first strategic partner. And then as time went on, we established partnerships with the Virginia Department of Education. The Virginia Department of Education is on a parallel path with the tribes here in Virginia to produce a curriculum and produce an environment where cultural education, cultural relevant pedagogy is taught in the classrooms. So we need the partnership of VDOE in order to move forward with the proper education. We also developed partnerships with some of the local LEAs. Our first step was to develop a partnership with the King William County School District system, mainly because there are 3 tribes in King William County that are wishing to be a part of the STEP activities. So we have LEAs, then we have the VDOE. Some of the strategic partners that worked with us were organizations such as the Academic Development Institute, the ADI, and also we have some other folks in the background, so to speak, that help us along with these agreements and partnerships. And these strategic partnerships fill a critical need for how we need to move forward. Otherwise, we would not be able to develop the processes that we need to develop within the Commonwealth.
Thank you, Ken. I know we'll hear some more about these partnerships a little later in our presentation too. And we recognize also that in practice and in your reality that there may be some overlap and gray areas in exactly how each of these relationships operates in your context. But we've thought it would be helpful just to differentiate as we go forward, and so we're all on the same page with the language that we're using. So our first engagement piece, audience engagement piece, is a poll question. If you click on that little poll tab to the right of our screen right now, you'll see this question, and we would love for you to submit your thoughts about this. What challenges have you encountered or might you anticipate if you're in the early stages of exploring some strategic partnerships? What challenges with growing those kinds of relationships have you encountered or might you anticipate? We'd love to see your thoughts over there in the poll. We will keep an eye on that and perhaps have an opportunity to address those challenges as we go along. But also feel free to submit questions as well. Okay, I'm not seeing any responses yet, but I know you're thinking about it, and you'll enter those into the poll area there. Okay. So throughout the session, you'll see that we employ some images and analogy of growing a garden to really frame this process of growing partnerships. So let's begin first with preparing the ground and creating that fertile soil or a rich environment for your garden of partners to grow. Before the seeds are planted, that ground has to be tilled and nourished. So how do you prepare the ground to grow partnerships? We'll pass it over, We'll pass it over to our panelists now to start talking about this aspect of starting partnerships.
One of the potential challenges I have found is that I am often the sole source of Indian education throughout the state. And perhaps some of you can relate to being the only person on staff or just a small group that is focused on American Indian issues, education, or whatever position you're in. However, somebody has to carry the water, and we signed up to do that. So in doing that, some of the things that we need to be aware of, that partnerships are key in helping to carry that water. If I didn't have my partners, I think I probably would have resigned years ago from this work. So partners are very important. And in the early stage, your collaborators might be able to help you identify groups with shared and complementary goals that can become your partners. You might actively investigate the policy priorities and goals of potential partners to avoid any conflicts. And when you are in the early stages of identifying potential partnerships to pursue, it may take an investment of your time to identify the right groups and organizations. You know, sometimes you on surface, a group or organization may seem perfect for you, but as you do a little bit more research and digging, you may find you have opposing views. So take your time and do your homework in developing those partnerships. Thank you.
Thank you, Johanna. And Ken, I know you have some experience with identifying some of that common ground with your work in VTEC.
Yes. When I first came on board as the project director for VTEC, one of the first orders of business was to reach out to the Virginia Department of Education. What I didn't realize at the time that the Virginia Department of Education was on a parallel path with VTEC in the Office of Equity and Community Engagement in developing processes and activities which would reflect cultural relevant pedagogy in the classroom. And of course, that was one of the driving forces of VTEC is to develop this cultural relevant education and our number one partner in this effort was the Virginia Department of Education. And we still are working weekly and monthly with VDOE to ensure that we're all on the same path. The other piece that I was looking into is, other than the Virginia Department of Education, of course, was activating the systems within VDOE to reach out to the LEAs, which had significant Native American populations within the Commonwealth. So our next step after reaching out to VDOE was to reach out to several LEAs to determine what work they were doing in this equity and community engagement process. So the first LEA that we had an agreement with, common ground, was with the King William County school system. The King William County school system, as I mentioned before, there are 3 tribes within the county, so they're already actively involved with the 3 tribes that were in King William. So this was an easy step for us to do, is to develop a legal binding partnership agreement with the King William County school system. So finding common ground is not that difficult if the discussions are relevant and realistic. And that's exactly what they are. They're realistic and they're relevant, and finding common ground with Virginia was a great step in moving forward.
Thank you, Ken. So Johanna, you have a few things to share about identifying those partners too, and identifying common ground.
Yes. As Ken shared in his examples, knowing the policy priorities of potential organizations can be really important for identifying potential alliances and partnerships. When identifying potential groups, agencies, and organizations to investigate, here are a couple of tips to remember. Identify your usual and unusual suspects and consider implications of politics and past work. I'll just give you a brief scenario. I've moved closer to my grandchildren and I've been able to pick them up from school. I always have yacht rock playing on my radio, and they always say, "Oh no, here comes Gigi's vintage music." So I've been adding some of their songs and changing the channels, and they've been more engaged with me since then. So do consider who's your usual, unusual suspects, and consider how even your actions may impact them. Know your community. In addition to tribal, federal, state, and school districts, collaborations, there may be a need to partner with private institutions such as private schools and private businesses. For planning and process purposes, it's important to consider the timelines and calendars that various organizations operate by. This is especially important if your goal is to influence or change policy and legislation. In my work, if we have an issue with a policy or we want to introduce or change a policy, we have to work 2 years ahead of the calendar. If something comes up, we're thinking, okay, in 2 years we can address it because of the calendars. So be especially cognizant of those calendars that will impact your work. As you consider groups to partner with and begin seeking opportunities to connect, you will want to prepare your elevator speech. The pitch should answer the question, what is your why? Have your specific ask ready. For example, when you present to tribal councils, school boards, or other groups, you will want to be prepared to share a specific ask so the group knows what it is you're asking for. Many times before I created my elevator speech, I was left holding an empty bag because I didn't know what my ask was. Groups will say, well, what do you need from us? What are you asking from us? So have your ask ready. And just briefly reflect back on my elevator pitch. I stated the problem of literacy proficiency. I proposed a solution in our educator preparation programs. While I didn't have a specific ask, I said, how can we collaborate? So you may need to tailor your speech to your specific audience.
Thank you, Johanna. That was a really nice setup and a transition to this slide.
Yes.
So, oh, did you want to say something, Ken?
No, I'm fine, thank you.
Okay. So we heard in the beginning, in the opening, we heard a little bit from both our panelists today who provided a bit of an elevator pitch, but we did want to just provide this little bit of an anatomy of an elevator pitch so that you can try this at home for yourself. So it's nice to have thought through this so that when the opportunity to advocate arises, you're ready to go. They say that luck is where opportunity meets preparation, so you'll want to have those talking points prepared. Now, in practice, this anatomy is laid out as a 1 minute elevator pitch, and that's a good challenge because it really forces you to hone your talking points. In reality, when I've done this exercise, my elevator pitch lands more around 90 seconds. So these are just guidelines to play with here. But you want to introduce yourself, provide a little bit of context, but resist the urge to say too much if you only have a smidget of attention, of that person's attention. Stating the problem, who is impacted, and how. A couple of really impactful talking points should be enough for there. And then devote a portion of that time to identifying a solution, staying focused on that identified problem and briefly describing a solution. Here's what's worked in other areas. Here's what research says. Here's where we're trying to promote. And then finally, to emphasize what Johanna said, made so eloquently, is have that ask ready, so that people know what your need is and what they can do for you, or pose the question, which I think was another good way. How can we collaborate? So even professionals are challenged by this. So don't. Maybe you want to practice at home. You can record yourself on your voice memo, or try out with a trusted colleague or friend. But it's a good exercise to have especially when you're looking for partnerships.
Tracy, may I add something?
Mm-hmm.
I know as a project director, you're going to be probably called on a lot to give an elevator pitch. Mm-hmm. They tell you that, but they may say, we have some time. Do you want to talk about your program? So what I have learned to do, my secret is I like to prepare, and before I step in to make that elevator pitch, clear my voice. And I know y'all have heard of the superhero pose. Stand up straight, push your shoulders back, put your arms on your hip, take that big, deep breath, and get ready to give your pitch. Thank you.
Yes, I'm thinking about our keynote speaker about getting all those good chemicals going in our body before you go in there. That I've done that superhero pose, and I think it works. All right. So just to summarize a few of our tips for when we're preparing the soil and getting ready to explore some partnerships. Some tips here to investigate those policy priorities. Maybe you're looking on websites or you're finding that strategic and annual plan where you can kind of see what the objectives are, what the priorities of that group is. Consult various calendars. Maybe they have timelines or certain windows of opportunity where you can get time on an agenda. As Johanna indicated, if we're looking to influence policy, that happens in a very deliberate cycle, and there's often postings for when public comments are opened. Open when policies are open for public comment, and that happens to according to a timeline. And so you'll want to take that into consideration when you're making your ask and you're making your elevator pitch. Okay. So let's now move into the next phase here, planting those seeds. Now that you've nourished the ground by learning about and seeking those partners that have either aligned or complementary priorities and mission, and maybe you've even secured some preliminary interest in forming an alliance with you, you're ready to plant those seeds for partnerships. And when seeds are first placed in the ground, it doesn't appear that much is happening on the surface, but in fact, a lot is happening out of sight as that seed cracks and that sprout begins pushing towards the light above ground. In some ways, this is the most critical stage of growth. If conditions are not right, that seed and your partnership will not sprout. So Johanna, you have a little bit to share here about potential challenges and how to address them.
Right. Some potential challenges I find that rise to the top is ambiguity. Nobody really knows, what the purpose about the project is, the priorities, or what their role is, or what their goal is. So be clear. If you have to read your vision and mission statement at every meeting, do it. Just be very clear. Navigating cross-cultural communications is essential. There's some things that Indian people do differently than non-Indian people do or say. And one of those that came to mind was the example of payment and honorarium. I tend to use honorarium when I talk to our tribal communities because payment seems so harsh of a word. Like, I'm going to pay you to come and sing for us or do something for us. I would rather honor them through that terminology and respect them by saying, I'm going to give you an honorarium. That lack of common terminology can really highlight that ambiguity. Just an example is the terms related to education and schooling. Oftentimes people will ask me, oh, when did tribes, really start valuing education? I'm like, I think you need to understand that Indian people have always valued education since time immemorial. And perhaps what you're talking about is forced education in the form of public schooling. Schooling is kind of a new concept given the context of what we're talking about. So that's a lack of common terminology. So hopefully you identified your partners based on some of those shared goals and priorities. So now that you're sitting at that table with your new partners, it's time to reach a shared understanding about how and where your organizations align. So again, be clear, navigate cross-cultural communications, and have common terminology. Thanks.
Thank you, Johanna. And Ken, you have some insights to share about your work at VTEC.
Let me give you a little bit of information, a little more information about VTEC itself as we move forward here. VTEC is now composed of 7 tribes, which I mentioned earlier in the program, 7 tribes, and we formed this tribal consortium through VTEC, within VTEC. Now, Why is that so important? In order to have all 7 tribes on board, we required and asked for support letters from each of the 7 tribes as we move forward. One thing we produce every quarter is a newsletter which provides information to all of the 7 tribes to ensure that we keep them informed. We always want to keep in mind the sovereignty of each individual tribe is paramount as we move forward, and VTEC recognizes that within our agreements with tribes. We meet with them, we work with them, we explain what we're doing, we are transparent in our activities to ensure we're doing the right thing for the tribes. The other group of partnerships that we're working with are education partnerships. That would be the Virginia Department of Education and LEAs. I mentioned the King William County LEA as a stop-off point because that was the beginning of what we did. And now I'm actively working on partnership agreements with 3 or 4 other tribes, as 3 or 4 other school districts as we move forward. Our partnerships agreements also included resource partners. Without resource partners from across the country, we would not have been able to be at this location at this time working on cultural relevant education in Virginia. We needed those resource partners to help us form the state tribal education partnerships. The first resource partner that I'd like to identify is TEDNA. TEDNA, of course, is Tribal Education Department's National Assembly. It was a main driver in helping us get started with the STEP process well over a year and a half ago. NARF was Native American Rights Fund was critical in some of the education processes and some of the training processes because VTEC, the board members of VTEC, had to be informed of how this process was going to work. The VTEC board is composed of 2 representatives from each of the 7 tribes, and they meet monthly to discuss where are we going, who we are going forward with, and how we're going forward with their processes. The other resource partner that we identified was the Academic Development Institute, which has been in business since the 1980s and has worked with several tribes across the nation. I would like to say, as part of this process, this consortium program works very well for Virginia tribes. I'm not sure it will work well for other tribes across the nation, but all of the 7 federally recognized tribes within the Commonwealth of Virginia are part of the partnership. That is amazing for me to be able to say we were able to achieve a consortium composed of all of the tribes in Virginia. That's a big step for us. So these partnership agreements, without these agreements, we could not get past go. So they're certainly necessary, and these relationships are critical as we move forward.
Having lived in Virginia myself during a time that predated the formation of the consortium, I can say that must have been a lot of work to bring those people together. And I'm reminded of one of the strategies that we talked about as we prepared for this session about a pre-meeting or before the partnership is actually launched, sort of that gathering phase to really better understand each other's needs and to come to a shared understanding of where that partnership will engage. Very good. So we have just a quick summary of our tips here. Johanna, did you want to take us through that?
Yes. In summary, here are tips for success when you are selecting and initiating partnerships and partnership agreements. Decide who is on the invite list. Consider the usual and unusual suspects. Are you always going to the same field to pick your potatoes? If so, maybe it's getting thin and you need to move on to a new spot. It helps to know your community and the various groups, agencies, and organizations that operate and focus on similar work. And give careful thought to establishing your non-negotiables. Know what you're willing to compromise on and what you cannot or will not negotiate to stay true to your purpose and mission. It is always good practice to begin with the end in mind and define what success will look like. Determine what the outcome will be for the projects. And these projects may look different across the board for the partners. An example is to look at project outcomes of what your potential partners have done. Were they successful? Were they not successful? What can they add to your banquet? Tracy?
Thank you. So I'm looking over at the challenges that folks have submitted under the polls tab, and one of them kind of relates to our point about that usual and unusual suspects. The challenge is about finding companies or groups that already have culturally relevant programs or are willing to build them for our people. And I know that can be a particular challenge for us in Indian country because every culture and community is so unique. But maybe looking in those unusual places in some of those areas that we've highlighted. But if other people want to chime into the chat box and share their thoughts and ideas, I welcome you to do that while we continue. So we've talked about agreements in a couple of different places. We've mentioned agreements or memorandums of understanding. So we did want to take just a minute to highlight some information that might be helpful because many of you are engaged in this type of negotiation. And one of the files that we have available for you in download is referenced here on the screen right now. Developing agreements between local education agencies, meaning schools or districts, and American Indian nations and tribal communities. And so that resource, in that resource, the authors did a survey of some existing memorandums of understanding that were out there to look at what were some common elements. And that's what we have there on the screen right now. This is just a few of them, but these memorandums often include, details about meetings, including the timing, the frequency, expected attendance. Some MOUs or MOAs, memorandums of agreement, also included provisions for participation on specific boards or committees. Others specified that reports or materials would be developed by one partner or provided prior to that meeting. Training is another common element that have often appeared in these memorandums of agreement. So whether it was the tribal nations partnering with school districts to create and deliver professional development about the local American Indian history or culture, tribal sovereignty, I know is one that appears a lot in some memorandums that I'm familiar with, as well as best practices for working with American Indian students and families. The flip side is, some of these agreements have provisions about school districts providing training or professional development, say, on data use or other educational hot topics and initiatives. Data sharing. So the quote that we included on the screen right there really emphasizes that elements like data sharing, as well as meetings, or if we're talking about equal opportunity and access, have a lot of communication implications, right? So if part of your MOU is about sharing data, there's probably more people involved with that, or may need to weigh in on that than just those at the table. Your chief information officers in a school, for example, they're going to be want to weigh in on how personal information will be protected and how the data will be formatted. So that's something to keep in mind when you're delving into those areas and forming agreements around that. Staffing. Some of these agreements have included tribal consultation on key hires, or perhaps even dedicated staff to work with American Indian communities and students. And logistics. This might be, you know, transportation to and from programs or sharing agreements for computer hardware and software. I think that was one of Johanna's examples earlier. Or funding, adjusting school calendars to account for certain, you know, cultural events or ceremonies and times of year. And then finally, that communication that I already mentioned, but from anything from family information nights to fiscal or data transparencies, communication is really the backbone of a lot of these agreements. And then we wanted to include and lift up this quote from that resource, which you can download, because this really emphasizes the point that while the agreements are important, the agreements may or may not be legally binding, but it's the process of having those conversations is just as important, perhaps even more important, especially where these conversations haven't taken place before. And so the quote just emphasizes that in most cases, the development of a common intent between those parties is as I said, just as important as the document itself. That piece of paper by itself can't build that trust and understanding and common purpose, but that negotiations, the conversations leading to the agreement are key. And then a final, just a little bit of business too for everybody. Since you are managing grants, there are some specific provisions that should be included in some of your agreements. If you are a demonstration ACE grantee, there is a template for a service provider agreement. I call it a template because those provisions should be included in your agreement. You don't have to use that exact template, but you should make sure that your agreements have those elements that are in the template. And the new competition that is currently out right now, the professional development grantees for 2021, same thing. There is a template for agreements that you'll want to have handy when you're negotiating and developing those agreements. Okay, so
Can I say
moving.
something?
Oh, please, yes.
Could I add to that a little bit? On these partnership agreements, one thing that I found out at the very early outset of developing those agreements was to develop some sort of trust relationship with the other party. And as time went on, what that meant was for us here in Virginia was each time I worked on a specific agreement with the Virginia Department of Education or for an LEA, I communicated with them as to the specifics that I wish to have in the agreement, the VTEC wished to have in the agreement, and asked them for what specifics they would like to see in the agreement. And we worked together from there, moving forward with a common trust and understanding and common purpose.
Thank you for that, Ken. I can see over in the poll tab here too, somebody did share that one of the challenges is that schools' willingness to prioritize culturally sustaining and revitalizing pedagogies and practice in their schools through family engagement, policy, and procedure. And so I'm sure they would love to hear more. Maybe throughout our session and when we get to the Q&A about what those conversations have looked like with your LEAs. Okay. So the next phase of growing our partnerships now is nurturing that growth. Now that you've planted those seeds of your partnership, you've defined your agreements, you may have to nurture those young shoots so that they continue to grow and bear fruit. Your partnerships won't flourish without proper care. And just like the plants in your garden, your partnerships need attention. So let's consider some of those potential challenges in this phase of growing your partnerships and hear how our panelists have persevered to grow strong partnerships.
Some of the potential challenges I faced is keeping our partners engaged and updated. Each partner may need a different mix of nutrients to grow, staying with our analogy. When I think about gardening, you might need to water more and you may need to water less in some areas, but you're still going to need water. And that's the communication and updates we're talking about. Some water is needed, but too much can drown a plant. I don't want to receive an email every day saying, oh, today we signed an agreement. Tomorrow we're going to copy the agreement and we'll send it to you. That's a lot if you're getting multiple one-line emails a day. So think about, I like to think of how many emails would I like to receive on an update? And then I will send those out, whether monthly, weekly, or whichever is most beneficial. You may need to supplement with more water, and water is heavy to carry. Again, carrying that water, it's doing all that behind the scenes work. Help when necessary. You have partners who are willing to help. Sometimes you may have to farm out some of this help. And in this stage of partnership development, it can be a challenge to keep everyone updated. So try staying on everyone's radar and keeping all your partners informed. And again, try not to overwhelm them. So it's key to strike a really good balance for maintaining momentum and active engagement in this work. To manage the logistics of planning, meeting, and communicating across multiple partners, it's going to require some time on your part. And again, maybe you have one person in, and it may not even be a staff member. Maybe it's one person within your little circle who you say, okay, I'm going to ask you to be responsible for sending out monthly emails and just, keep it like a blast. I like to send out bulleted blasts because not everybody wants to read a 3-page newsletter. Some do, but some don't. Thank you.
Thank you, Johanna. I know I've had to learn in doing collaborative work that it's okay to say, can you send out that email, to that follow-up email, or can you send those notes out, rather than always taking it on and taking on that responsibility. Thank you. So Ken, you've also had some experiences with your partnerships.
Yes, I have. The one experience that I had, of course, was for everyone to come together, all the 7 tribes to come together. So that required a lot of communication, a lot of discussion, a lot of planning to grow this organization with all 7 tribes. They're all in different locations, of course, all have different programs within the individual tribes. So trying to find a specific location for common ground for all of us I wouldn't say it was difficult, it was just time consuming. Just have to be very patient and grow accordingly what the tribes are, or the location the tribes are in, and the specific goals of the individual tribes. The STEP project, State Travel Education Partnership, was not on our radar screen until about 18 months ago. So we've come a long way to form this consortium. And all of us, each of us had to adapt. Each of us had to communicate with each other, keep the flow transparent as possible, to ensure that everyone was on board and ensure that the activities with VTEC represented all of the tribes, not just some of the tribes. So it was a major step for VTEC to come together in the way that it has. And now we're in the process of building capacity here in the Commonwealth of Virginia to ensure that our students have cultural relevant education within the classroom. And that's one of our main goals. Another one of our goals, as I expressed to the tribes, was to recruit and retain teachers and develop education processes for teachers that they can also understand cultural relevant education, and the tribes understand that that's what the teachers are doing also.
Thank you, Ken. So just thinking about those communications and coordinating the logistical challenges, I know one of the things that we had talked about was really coordinating all those schedules for those trainings to happen. are those, they were provided by NARF, I believe, the Native American Rights Fund?
Well, there were several trainings. There were other resource partners that developed some trainings for us. But NARF also developed a significant amount of trainings and still is to this day. We're working with NARF all the time to ensure that the trainings that are developed are legal within the guidelines of the federal government. And NARF, being a Native American Rights Fund and a legal body, is very, very pertinent when it comes to developing legal relationships and legal understandings.
And just so I'm clear too, is it the tribes that participate in that training, or do the districts, the schools and district personnel also participate?
I'm sorry, I didn't explain that well. The trainings that we provided, in most cases, they were for board members, because the VTEC board, as I said, is composed of members from each of the 7 tribes. And there have been extensive periods of training from NORF and other agencies that have helped the VTEC board grow as an organization, help the VTEC board grow and adapt as an organization and communicate as an organization with other entities. VTEC is a driving force here in Virginia as we speak. We have developed a body of bylaws. We have developed strategies and activities about how we can move forward with cultural relevant education. That's the main thrust of what we're doing. Of course, we're trying to grow, adapt, communicate with all these other entities, just as they're trying to adapt to us.
Thank you. Thank you. So to summarize our tips for this stage.
Yes, here are tips for success when nurturing the growth of your partnerships. Be persistent. Small, consistent steps will add up over time. You know, in my personal time, I'm trying to complete my doctorate, and I've got this huge, what I feel is this huge, overwhelming paper to write my dissertation. But I keep remembering in the back of my mind an old adage, even an elephant can be eaten one bite at a time. So take those small steps, they will add up. It's important to learn the business process and procedures of your partners. And we talked about this before. Knowing how to navigate payment and honorariums for subject matter experts, especially elders, will help build trust and credibility. Maintain ongoing, clear, concise communications and communicate your success frequently. I know Ken has talked about a newsletter he publishes quarterly. Plan to share at your regular staff meetings and seek new news outlets. And consider submitting your session proposals for conferences. I know NIEA is coming up, so consider that. Share your successes. Submit your stories to tribal newspapers. Give updates at different staff meetings. Go anywhere and everywhere. And at this stage, be prepared for growth and change so things don't move outside your comfort zone. You know, you don't want to start adding so many partnerships that one partner overwhelms everybody and takes on your project and it doesn't even become yours anymore. So just be mindful of that. And when you can, budget money for travel to meet in person. I personally will go out to my tribe, the tribes, and meet with tribal councils and tribal ed departments at least once a year. I try to do it twice a year, and it's to honor and respect that government to government relationship with our tribes. And another thing I want to draw your attention to is up in the corner, you see Idaho State Department. Every year I have to write a JFAC report. So I feel like this is my time to truly write my narrative of what I want our legislators to know. So remember that when you're writing these reports, you have it within your power to develop and strengthen one powerful narrative of what the work it is you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we've reached the harvesting and storing stage of our partnerships. As your partnership grows and reaches maturity, you'll be able to reap those benefits of the time and energy that you've invested in developing those partnerships. You may need to adjust to changes in the environment to sustain those partnerships. And you can build your partnership stores by showing gratitude and sharing the successes. So some challenges that you might anticipate in this stage are staff turnover in your partnerships or maybe even within your organization. This could be a real hindrance if all that institutional knowledge leaves with individuals, and new staff don't always immediately know the history or the successes of those partnerships. Even with original partners and staff, you might find that the initial excitement that you've experienced at the beginning starts to wane, or attention to the work of your partnership starts to compete with other pressing issues.
Yes, and community engagement is very much a priority in partnerships in sustaining support for your work. You really want to look at how you can engage the community. Maybe you're working with a tribal ed department, but maybe you can work with facilities, or maybe you can work with energy or natural resources. So think about sustaining your community engagement.
I would like to add a word to that. I noticed during our sessions with the Virginia Tribal Education Consortium, one of the issues that came up was at one point they were getting too much training, and that sort of dropped their energy level a bit, and the momentum could have possibly dipped at that time. However, we overcame that and adjusted ourselves so we wouldn't have too much training, too much activity for the board itself, because most of those people have full-time jobs and we're meeting in the evenings. So we had to be very careful about those types of challenges.
Thank you. That's a good insight.
Here are our tips for success in maintaining momentum as your partnerships matures and evolves. Expressing thanks and gratitude for the work of your partners is important to the relationship. Acknowledge the contributions of your partners. You may consider sending an email to individuals, thanking them for their contributions. And I always like to copy their supervisor. I help oversee an annual conference. And at the end of the conference, my practice within my department, because I have a lot of coworkers who will come and do some of that carrying the water work, I will do a handwritten note. And, if I'm really familiar with them, maybe I'll give them some cedar or sweetgrass. But if they, are just someone who pitched in and did something nice for me, I will bake a batch of brownies and give them a handwritten note with a brownie. So, consider doing something for them because they are doing something for you, and just be considerate of those cultural practices. Maintain regular updates. Keep your strategic partners informed about your work, your successes, your goals, and especially your needs. Just recently, I had a planning meeting, and one of our members who's in the community, she said, well, what do you need? And we said, well, we're trying to get money to pay for a dinner. She said, give me some time. We got an email last week, and she said, I've got the money for you from a local bank. So, again, always have those elevator pitches in the forefront, because you'll never know when someone can meet your needs. Also, remember to keep constant contact with tribal councils, school boards, and if applicable, state legislators, because they're all venues for delivering those updates. Again, take charge of your narrative. Develop summaries to communicate and celebrate successes. Documenting and communicating successes is crucial for current partners to celebrate and also to uplift uplift the positive outcomes and benefits of the partnership. This will help maintain support for the work. Yes, there will be staff turnover, and it will be necessary to efficiently provide information about your work. It's also important to let the community, your partners, and your founders know the benefits of your work. Those summaries are also helpful for you when you're pursuing new partnerships or funding. I do an end of the year report. And if I have a grant, I try to, keep all my activities. So if someone says, hey, what you're doing, can you share with me? I have it ready to go to send to an email. So make sure that, you're communicating and they know the work you're doing. And last but not least, continue to hone that elevator pitch. You need to advocate to people with decision-making power and connections to purse strings. You'll never know who you may meet who is able to write you that check that you need. You're your own advocate, so get out there and get the work done. Thanks.
Thank you. So we have some time now left for some questions, and you can still submit your questions into that that poll if you have any questions for our presenters here. I'm going to go ahead and pause my screen share for a minute so we can have a little bit of open dialogue here with. Do we have any questions? Anything that you heard along the way that you want to hear more about? I know the one question that I lifted up earlier. Either of you, Ken or Johanna, please feel free to respond to this. But one of the challenges that was shared was, when you're working with schools and districts and trying to get them to buy into using these culturally sustaining and revitalizing pedagogies. Have you had any experience with having those conversations and how, I don't want to say convince, but to convey the importance and the impact that can have for serving Native children?
Well, one of the things that's happened here in Virginia is a General Assembly actually established a committee on relevant cultural relevant education as part of the process that we're going to be involved in over the next many years. So there's a committee that's meeting, and the committee that has to give its report back to the state government on cultural relevant education. So for me, that was a major piece of activity at the state level that helps us along the way. And that was great. That was great knowledge for me. And I'm so pleased to know that the Commonwealth of Virginia, which so long lagged in education when it came to Virginia Indians, is now at the forefront to get cultural relevant education in the classroom. So I'm very pleased about that. It's one of our
One of the things I really want to highlight is this is titled strategic partnerships. So you really have to be strategic. If I want to work with a certain LEA, I will go there and kind of look around and see who's going to be my most strategic partner. Is it the superintendent? Is it a school board member? Is it a really active and engaged community member? So see who those people are who already have a voice that's being heard.
And I'm really thinking too, Ken, your point about working, being able to identify that state level priority, that must have some import when you're having conversations with folks at the school and district level too. If you can link it to priorities that are already in front of them, that sort of helps elevate and push that, that the state is saying that equity is important, and here we are doing the work to make education more equitable for our Native students. So that's a really nice alignment, and being able to emphasize the overlap there of priorities.
And Tracy, we've talked a lot about verbiage and language. So I will be remiss if I don't say this. When you're talking about equity, please don't let your potential partners be confused with being equal. You know, being equal means giving everybody a pair of shoes. Having equity means everybody gets a pair of shoes that fit.
Right.
I like that analogy. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's see. Any other questions for our panelists or presenters? So we have a little bit of time left, and we did want to get a little more input from our audience here. And you see over in the polling area, we have these 3 questions that we'd like you to respond to. After participating in our session today, what is something that you will stop doing after participating in today's session? What is something that you will start doing after participating in this session? And then what is something you want to learn more about with regards to growing strategic partnerships? Go ahead and enter those responses into the chat, and we'll keep an eye on that. But in the meantime, I see that one of our participants has posted in the chat, just noting that trying to find those active, engaged people has been a challenge when we're not allowed to travel. A lot of communities are still not open to travel, given the situation with the pandemic at the moment. Okay, so I'm starting to see some responses to our poll questions here. Need to refresh. I see somebody else also likes the analogy of the shoes that fit, for analogy about equity. Oops. Okay, so I'm not seeing any poll responses yet, but maybe everyone is still thinking about what you will start doing and what you will stop doing. And we're also interested in learning what you want to learn more about. I know some challenges that folks had posted at the beginning were about lack of communication or responding to, reminding partners of agreed upon tasks. I'm wondering if you heard anything there in your in the presentation that maybe you can take away and apply to your situation or your partnership in your work. Another challenge that was noted was sharing the workload and responsibilities equally or as agreed upon. I don't know if Ken or Johanna, if you have any thoughts or reflections
Sure.
about that particular challenge.
Yes, I would like to respond to that. In discussions about the board itself, the VTEC board, as I said, is composed of representatives from each of the 7 tribes. And one of the efforts that I'm working on as we speak is basically to try to spread some of the work that I'm working with the board to accomplish, spread some of that work to other people on the board, more folks on the board, rather than having the employees do everything. The board, trying to get the board to be a bit more proactive in certain areas, which they're not very active in right now. And one of the things that happened early on, as I said, is even though I would like to see the board doing more work, um, I can't emphasize enough that there was a little bit more overtraining at the beginning, and some board members started to quibble about that because of course they're working full-time jobs, most of them. So I have to be really careful about that type of delegation of responsibility.
Thank you. I see some of our poll results now are starting to show up. So things that people saying they're going to start doing is regular communication, uh, paying attention to shared leadership, having weekly check-ins or communications, communicating with a regular basis. So a lot around communication there. We had one submission under something I'll stop doing is assuming that things are being done. That's a good one. And we have some interest here in still learning more about native owned providers. Very good. We got about 5 minutes left in case you have any questions you want to submit to our panelists here today. I'm so grateful that they were able to be here and to share their experience and wisdom with their work with partnerships with us today. I'll note that we have one of the last polls in our polls tab is the rating of our sessions. So we please ask you to give us a star. 1 star is not so great. 5 stars is that this is awesome. And if you have in the time that you have between the next session, you've got about 15 minutes. You can take that time to visit the social wall in the Pathable platform, see what people are saying about the conference session. You can post a chat on the discussion board. You can also download the files from this presentation in 2 places, actually, from the Files tab here within our presentation space. You can also go to the resource library and you can find all of the slides and tools and materials that were shared during our session here today. Okay. Well, I think we've gotten all the input on our polls. Either that or my refresh button is just a little bit slow. But I want to thank all of our participants for adding your voice and lifting up your questions today, and to thank our panelists for your time and commitment to doing this good work. Oh, I see when somebody there said they're going to stop sending so many emails. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Johanna.